Hi, welcome to the fifth and final session of the conference, Homes in the Street. We have looked at the neighborhood at three different scales, from interventions at the scale of the city, to the commons, to the street. And now we look at the finest scale, that of the threshold of the dwelling to the street. But before we start, I'd like to remind people of the competition that follows the conference. If you'd like to participate, you need to fill out the form that's on our website. All you need is your registration number, the one that you use to log in here every session. And if you are forming a team, then others that are registered too. It's really to bring actual change to our neighborhoods, to our cities. As designers, we need to be thinking about these improvements, think how we can spatially restructure our environment. The awards will be for the four different categories: redefining the city for the public, the commons in the city, streets in the neighborhood, and homes in the street. And there'll be one jury award for the most innovative design idea. We have an excellent international jury of architects and urbanists, and the awards will be announced on December 19th. So do participate. It's an opportunity to reapportion public space in society, in our neighborhoods, all for the common good. Uh, and there's a second competition too that we have launched, a short film competition that will be held annually from now on. It's on urban issues and is called Nagri. We envisioned that it'll be a kind of a bioscope on Indian towns and cities. And this year, the focus will be the short films on housing adequacy as defined by the UN as a fundamental right, the right to shelter, the right to adequate shelter. This too is on our website. And so if you are interested in signing up to participate in this, do let us know. We have funding for 12 short films, which are just 4 to 5 minutes long. So do sign up to form a team with filmmakers, architects, and social scientists to develop a film outline and to register. These two competitions are both announcing their awards on December 19th at a joint event. Of course, they are both very much linked to this conference, as they too are dealing with urban issues at different scales, at nestle scales. And film is such a great medium to make these connections. So, back to our conference. We've been describing the sessions as zooming in on scale at these nestle scales. But another way of describing them would be to define them in terms of the private public realm. The first two were all about the public realm. But by the time we discussed streets in the neighborhood, we were talking about the street taking on many programmatic elements, which were partly the private realm superimposed on what would be public space. So our discussion, our resolution was in negotiating these overlays. In this session today, Homes in the Street, we are looking at the private realm, that of the dwelling, interfacing directly with the public. The first lecture by Tom Avermaete is titled The Viral Balcony, an Individual Lighthouse of the Commons. The balcony is that projection of the private into the public realm. Similar architectural elements are, you could say, the veranda, the otla, or the front porch in North America, all of which reinforce the sense of community. And I think perhaps even defines the neighborhood. The relationship of these elements, projections from the home, is what one could argue make the character of the neighborhood. Zhang, who will give the second lecture, has designed wonderful incisions of public program in what would be the private realm within a hutong. He will share with us in his talk, Rethinking Basics, his micro children's library and art center, and other projects since then developing on those ideas. We will then have a discussion and question and answer session led by Rahul Mehrotra, followed by the closing keynote by Alejandro Aravena. Alejandro will present a marvelous project in his talk entitled A Bridge, a Park, and a Bank, all in one. This project really exemplifies, to my mind at least, the role we as architects can play in the siting and spatial organization of a building. That will be followed by another discussion. So we have a lot ahead of us, all very interesting and exciting work. I will now briefly introduce Tom Avermaete, Zhang, and Rahul Mehrotra. Tom Avermaete is professor of the history and theory of urban design at ETH in Zurich. Tom has a special research interest in the architecture of the city in Western and non-Western contexts, and his research focuses on the changing roles, approaches, and tools of architects and urban designers. He has co-authored several books. A couple of them I'm going to mention. One is on the balcony with Rem Koolhaas, which he did in 2014. He also worked on the balcony, the gallery at the 2014 Venice Biennale, which Koolhaas curated. Closer to home, Tom has written a book titled Casablanca, Chandigarh, Reports on Modernity with Casiato also in 2014. Zhang is the founder of ZAO, Standard Architecture, with a wide range of realized work. His studio has emerged as one of the most critical protagonists among the new generation of Chinese architects. His studio's work has been exhibited and published to international acclaim. His work was acquired by the New York MoMA Permanent Collection, and he has been awarded the Alvar Aalto Medal in 2017 and the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2016, among many, many others. And I found out just the other day that Zhang's undergraduate thesis at Tsinghua University in Beijing was on Charles Correa's work. So that was really interesting. And anyway, and finally, Rahul Mehrotra, the discussant for this last session. Rahul is the founder principal at RMA Architects, and he teaches at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. He is chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, director of the Master of Architecture in Urban Design degree program, and the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization. Rahul will be the discussant for this session, and then we'll introduce Alejandro Aravena, who will give the closing keynote. So now over to Tom Avermaete. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Nondita Correa Mehrotra, for inviting me to this conference, and to Rahul Mehrotra for moderating the session of today. I'm very happy to be with you, and I must say I had the occasion to meet Charles Correa one time in person when he was lecturing at Delft University of Technology a few years ago, and it made a big impression, an unforgettable impression on me, I must say. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this conference. What I would like to do today is to talk about an urban element that is maybe not that often discussed because it's considered to be an element that is just part of the urban decorum, a sort of ordinary piece of the city, a bit of a forgotten feature of the city as well, and that is the balcony. And that is what my talk of today will revolve around. May I please have the PowerPoint presentation? The viral balcony and individual lighthouse of the commons. The urban element that I want to talk about is indeed the balcony, an element of which I will claim in this talk that it fulfills a key role in the city, especially in the relation between the home and the city, the theme of this conference. I've been interested in this element for quite some time. My research started about 10 years ago, and I'm particularly interested in the fact that this element fulfills a sort of threshold function, mediating between house and city, between interior and exterior, between private and public, between the individual and the collective realm. As was already mentioned, this research, or the set of the first research results, were shown at the 2014 Venice Biennale, but I must say that I became again very interested in the balcony in the beginning of this year when the corona pandemic hit the world, and when I think this balcony regained a sort of new meaning, and I will talk about that in the second half of my talk. But let me first give you a little history of the balcony. After all, in my mind, the balcony, as we know it today, is probably a very recent urban element. In the European city, the balcony first appeared on the urban scene as a sort of military element in the form of the bretèche, as you see here, or also the brattice. The balcony was an element that was added to fortresses, castles, and burghs to defend the city against intruders. From this cantilevered urban element, projectiles could be directed at the enemy, as you can see at the right-hand side of the image here. Soon, however, the balcony would become a more generalized urban element, no longer a place from where to attack people, but rather to address them, be it still from a very elevated and powerful position, as we can see in the St. Peter's Basilica to the left, in Rome, of course, or the town hall of Copenhagen with its various balconies above the entrance gate and on the tower to the right. However, in many European cities, the balcony would also soon become an element of the everyday urban fabric. This was, for instance, the case in Paris, as you see on the screen here, where the mid-19th century transformations by Baron Haussmann introduced the balcony not only as an omnipresent element, but also as a stage of bourgeois, as you can see, public life and private life maybe as well. In other places in the world, the balcony seems to have evolved as a special form of window that establishes new relations between the street and the dwelling. The Egyptian balconies with majrabias are a prime example how a very nuanced but also very dynamic relation between the domestic sphere of the house and the civic sphere of the street was negotiated or is negotiated. The balcony with majrabia regulates the way that the domestic sphere of the house is in touch with the civic realm of the streets, but also vice versa. It controls the degree to which the public gaze and sound enter the sphere of the house. In architectural culture, and this might be a bit unknown to you, the balcony was not always warmly embraced. Quite on the contrary, it was often seen as a very disturbing element. Try to look at the citation that I have on the screen right now from the French architectural theoretician Quatremer, who in his Dictionnaire historique d'architecture from 1833 was extremely critical of what he called the modern balcony fashion. And you can read, he was writing, "Nothing spoils the form of the openings more than the inordinate length of the balcony. These elements," and he was referring to balconies, "are foreign to good architecture," he was saying. Quatremer dismissed the balcony and many of his contemporaries as a superfluous element that did not contribute to the quality of the architecture nor to the value of urban life. This viewpoint was reverberated in the work of many artists and writers afterwards. Here we see, for instance, René Magritte, who was also dismissing, to the right-hand side, who was dismissing the bourgeois balcony because he thought it was a sort of platform of a sort of lifeless bourgeois culture, as you can see here. This attitude towards the balcony changed, however, at a certain moment, and I would locate that moment in the beginning of the 20th century. At that moment, indeed, this architectural element, the architectural element of the balcony, was made part of a sort of universalist catalogue of modern elements. And this was done by incorporating, we could say, the balcony in a sort of reformist rhetoric of the provision of health and hygiene. What in the late 19th century was still a sort of discussed as a disconcerting urban element, was now giving a place at the center of modern architectural discourse. As you can see from the cover of this book, Befreites Wohnen, which was published in 1929 after the first CIM meeting, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, by the Swiss critic Siegfried Guignon, who locates the balcony firmly in a broader modernist rhetoric on emancipation towards new ways of living. The balcony is depicted as an element that introduces light, air, and openness, as you can see, I hope, from the image on the screen. Surprisingly, in the 20s and 30s, the balcony would let's say, gradually get a much more central place in several modern architectural discourses and practices. It became a sort of conspicuous feature, we could say, of the modernist house, but also of the modernist city, as you can see here. Also in post-war architectural culture, the balcony would start to play a very important role in dealing with pressing urban issues. The balcony, for instance, became the architectural element par excellence to deal with the relation between the mass and the individual in a wide variety of housing projects. The French architect Gérard Granval offers an interesting example of in his housing project called Les Choux in Créteil, near Paris. The challenge in these types of projects was the engagement with the new collectivity and the anonymity that emerged from these housing environments for an upcoming mass society. Supported by the evolution of precast concrete in France, Granval proposed a system of petal-shaped balconies. Which gave the buildings their unique appearance, but above all, installed a new figure of screening, the border between the realm of the individual and that of the mass, allowing as well a sort of visual engagement with the public realm outside, the public realm of the city, and offering a high degree of privacy to the individual. Almost simultaneously to Granval, the Spanish architect Ricardo Bofill offered his view on the encounter between mass and individual, between monument and niche, we could say, for the housing project in Barcelona, the so-called Walden 7 project. In the Walden housing project, the monumentality of the apartment buildings is emphasized by treating them as a very big form, a gross form as we call that, with enormous cavities, as you can see. And also here, the balconies played a crucial, and we could even say a paradoxical role. They appear as elements that remind, on the one hand, we could say, of a long Mediterranean tradition of outdoor rooms that complement the interior dwelling, but their small size also suggests a different reading. The balconies in this project, and you see them also on the plan you can detect these very small balconies as well. These balconies were not conceived as places to stay or to appropriate. That's what their limited surface makes immediately visible. However, what they do is that they symbolize the presence of the individual inhabitant within the bigger matrix of mass housing. The balcony would also play a very important role in the emergence of a new urban figure in the European metropolis, the urban figure of the modern skyscraper. And this was, for instance, the case in the project Torres Blancas by Francisco Javier Sáenz de Ozza in Madrid. Science de Alza was concerned with articulating a new collectivity and was interested in defining the European typology of a modern skyscraper. He imagined the balcony would play a very important role in bringing this typology of high-rise dwelling in tune with European ideas of collectivity and of the local climate as well. The balcony would play an important role in acculturating, we could say, the typology of vertical living to the culture and climate of Madrid or of Spain. Science de Alza provided all of his apartments with generous circular balconies, as you can see from the plan to the left, that would not only provide space to the South European outdoor family life, but also provided spaces of outdoor shade to the various apartments. The result was a newfangled typology and an outlook of vertical living for the South European city. That balconies are important mediators between the public and the private realm was also explored in post-war architectural projects, and this time in post-war architectural projects by French architects working in the North African city of Casablanca, Morocco. The architects in these projects focused particularly on the borders of the balcony and explored how this could be understood differently from different cultural perspectives. In the drawings here, we see how these architects distinguished between, to the left, what they called Muslim dwellings, who have a very strong visual and sound border between the public and the private realm. And so the balconies, as you can see, hopefully on the drawing to the left, have very, very high walls, let's say. And they were differentiating this with what we see to the right, where they were planning for European inhabitants, and where they believed that the border between the private realm and the public realm was a much more transparent, a much more osmotic, you could say, relation, relating to a very different articulation of the borders of the balconies. So this relation of the private and the public leading to a very particular way of dealing with the balcony. I'm showing you here some of the balconies that were with these very strong borders between the private and the public realm that were made for the Muslim dwellers of Casablanca. The balcony in the post-war period was also looked upon as a place where indeed different cultures could be brought together, as a symbolic place, we could say as well, as is illustrated in this project by the French architect Fernand Pouillon, who was working in Algiers, the North African city of Algiers, for his housing project called Diyar al-Masul in 1957. Especially in the towers of this housing project, it becomes clear how Pouillon tried to bring the symbols of different dwelling cultures that were present in the city together within this figure of the balconies. The wooden scaffold work in the lower parts of the balconies refers to the architecture of the traditional Ottoman housing, as you can see in the image to the right. While at the higher part of the tower, with their screens and their prefabricated terracotta elements, refer to a more modern way of building and living, but also the colorful sculptural elements make reference to tribal patterns and decorations that belong to more older forms of dwelling in Algeria. Many architects in the post-war period were also interested in how to explore the balcony as a way to create a variation a variation in the border between the public and the private realm. That the balcony was also a site where this could be mediated was, for instance, explored by the Italian architect Gio Ponti in his housing for the Via Dezza in Milano of 1957. Ponti is referring here with his design to a tradition of subtly screening the border between the house and the city, which was present already sort of in the Mediterranean area. but he's in some kind of way modernizing that, we could say, and he's designing his balconies as a set of frames that allows the inhabitant to mediate between the public realm out there of the city and the private realm of the house. These frames, in these frames, various elements could be posed, let's say, elements that are more artifactual elements, elements that are more screen, and together all of these elements, they mediate, we could say, between the public realm and the private realm. Ponti called this inhabitable viewing frames and believed that these viewing frames, they created indeed a set of frames and surfaces between the public realm of the street and the private domestic realm of the house, projecting that in various conditions. Last but not least, there were quite a bit of architects in the post-war period that believed that the balcony was also a site of everyday politics, a site where inhabitants could have their single voices heard, and where they could co-produce, as it were, the city, would have a say and a co-production of the city. This was, for instance, the case of the Spanish architect Antonio Coderch, who was speaking about sharing responsibilities and speaking about the co-production of the city already in the 1960s. In his proposal for the Viviendas de las Cocheras in Barcelona, the Spanish architects illustrates how this can be implemented in an urban design strategy. In his projects, the balconies are understood as polyvalent spaces in which inhabitants can interfere, if only by choosing a certain set of plants, a certain set of greening for the city. While in the period after the post-war, great avant-garde experiments with the balcony were performed, as I hope that I show to you right now, by architects and urban designers, at the same time, I have the feeling that many of the qualities of the balconies became forgotten or were even muted. Many buildings, particularly in economically disadvantaged areas, were constructed without balconies. I'm showing you a housing tower in Les Sarcelles in France here. Or balconies were simply considered as marginal elements, not really worthy of design, that could be prefabricated and readily attached to whatever building. Or in other cases, even closer to today, balconies were considered as purely aesthetic elements that endorsed the facade, but had very, very little dwelling qualities. That the balcony did remain an important urban element became, in my mind, clear in the beginning of 2020, when the COVID pandemic hit the world. As part of the attempt to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic, many citizens, and I think we all know about that, were from the beginning of March 2020 advised to permanently remain within the private domain of their home. In an unprecedented intrusion of the state in everyday life, citizens were required to restrict their use of the public space as well as their public interactions to the bare minimum. Slogans as confinement and social distancing became part of the ordinary discourse on the city. Luckily, dissociating citizens from social life and from the public sphere is in contemporary societies not docilely accepted. On the contrary, I would say, citizens all over the world have searched for alternative ways to appear in public, for other ways of meeting their fellow citizens, for other tactics to share. Sometimes this was done through digital channels, as we are doing right now, but very often they were also to do that in an analog way. And in my mind, there was one urban element that played a key role, namely the balcony. Indeed, citizens explored the capacities of the balconies to bring practices that are normally situated within the interior to the exterior, and thereby recalibrate these practices. Practices like cutting hair, as you can see here in the city of Zurich, or practices like working in the home office, which were now brought onto the balcony and thereby given a new character. But also the reverse was true. Practices that are normally performed in the city or even in the wider urban territory were now brought to the domestic sphere of the house, onto the balcony. Citizens started to perform a variety of sports activities on the balcony. But also the practice of gardening was brought into close proximity of the home, reconnecting, I would say, the rural and the urban in a new fashion, but also offering the city an unprecedented green layer. In times of COVID-19, the balcony also provided an ideal platform to create urban collectives in new ways. Citizens observed and participated in urban life from the safe space of the balcony. They created literally new urban collectives from their balcony, if only by clapping, as we see here and here. But they also did more sophisticated things, we could say. They organized concerts from their balconies, where indeed the balcony both became the stage and the seats of the concerts. People were simply engaging in talks with their neighbors thanks to the safe space of the balcony, but they were also participating in collective events such as religious processions, or more civic festivities like this popular spring festival in Murcia, Spain. The relation between collectivity and individuality was indeed strongly recalibrated. Thanks to the balcony, citizens were also able in times of COVID to explore new relations between intimacy and publicity. The practice of praying individually, but also being part of a larger public movement, was one of the ways that the careful relations between intimacy and publicity were re-explored. Last but not least, during the COVID pandemic, the balcony also became a platform for the expression of micro and macro political ideas. Balconies were used to express national solidarity, as we see to the left. And as you could, in Italy, with the Italian tricolore, and in Belgium, with the white flags to the right. The balcony became also a site where individual political viewpoints were uttered. Banners with individual political messages appeared on the railings of balconies. Alles wird gut, tout ira bien. However, the balcony also became the locus for more provocative political viewpoints of the city and its future. New ways to generate energy off the grid, as we can see to the left-hand side in Moscow, and new perspectives to think collectivity in the city across property borders, as the example to the right shows in Rome. I come to my conclusion then. COVID-19 has shown once again that the balcony is an important urban element for our lives in cities. What the practices during the COVID pandemic have illustrated is that urban elements as the balcony have the capacity to engage with the complexities and the ambiguities of our contemporary urban condition. Balconies have the ability to create spaces of calmness and retreat that are not outside the city, but are firmly situated within the vivid and dense urban life. Balconies offer us the opportunity to have open and productive green spaces into the midst of our most urbanized territories. Balconies also have the capacity to connect individuals into new collectives, not by grouping them into a single space, but by interconnecting them visually and in terms of sound. Last but not least, balconies offer citizens ways to appear in the public realm, not by entering on the street or on the square, but while being in the privacy of their home. They offer a sort of niche in which citizens can express the citizen can express her or himself, a place where the practices and ideas of the individual can be observed and thus influence the practices of others. It is for all of the above reasons that the balcony, in my mind, is a key urban element. that not only might help us to face some of the important urban challenges related, for instance, to densification, climate, or urban nature, but also deserves, again, full-fledged attention from architects and urban designers. Thanks.
I am Zhang of Zhao Standard Architecture. It's a great honor for me to join this lecture series of Z-Axis in honor of Charles Correa. It's in fact, Charles Correa has been my hero since my student time. 20 years ago, my master's degree thesis in Tsinghua University in Beijing was on Charles Correa and the theory of Charles Correa and the Enlightenment to Chinese cities. So it's for me, it's a very important and an honor to join this lecture series. So I understand my session today is on the homes in the street. First of all, thank you, Nondita, for your invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here today. Virtually be here. And hope I can actually be here soon. Let me share my screen, starting. I am, since we're talking about homes in the street, and then I think it would be appropriate for me to show only the small built projects that I've been doing since 2012. And what I call in Beijing, in the old city of Beijing, which I call the micro series, and touching upon different aspects of old city renewal in the historical city of Beijing. My topic is rethinking basics. Well, I have used this title, seemingly not very attractive title, quite some years ago, but I think in terms of suddenly this title becomes so relevant in our current time, especially amidst this pandemic, which bring us back to contemplate more about our cities and our communities. So after discussion with Nondita, and then we agreed that Rethinking Basics is again a appropriate title. So at the same time, I think Rethinking Basics also provides us a chance of always going back to the most fundamental questions. And by answering these most fundamental questions, with our contemporary situation and understanding of our problems now in a different way, we have a chance of giving new and innovative answers to questions. The questions, the problems might be the same, but our proposals and answers could be really different and therefore somehow innovative. And in terms of old city renewal, I always believed that there's also new ways that the space of innovation and the question of conservation does not necessarily conflict to each other. So in order to get into this series of micro scale problems and projects, I think it would be interesting to introduce to every one of you from the big scale of the city. Here is overall master plan of Beijing city. You see the inner circle is the second ring, which highlights the historical old city, which started in the Yuan dynasty, the Kublai Khan time. Actually, the Mongolian Kublai Khan established Beijing city as a capital. And then you see the third ring, fourth ring, fifth ring. It just expands. But the inner city has always been the definitive character of Beijing city. This first project I show is not totally part of the micro series, but this is how the project that the competition I won that brought me back from New York back to Beijing, that was 2001, was the City Wall Park competition, which surprisingly was the first competition I entered after graduation, and then we won. And the question, this, as you probably know, the city wall of Beijing, the old city wall of Beijing, was demolished in the 50s and 60s. And then almost everything's been demolished. And by the year 2000, the government suddenly discovered there was a segment on the southeast corner of the old city, immediately to the south of the Beijing railway station, was left. It was about 1.5 kilometers. It was kept because of the construction workers built huts around it when they were building the railway station. So by 2001, the city started a competition, international competition, to talk about how and what we should do with this. Briefing asks people, teams to propose for what to do with the city wall. It's half broken part, and the relationship. The competition was really. We raised the question as why we are doing a project on the wall. So which means the raison d'être of the whole project, why we need to do something to the wall. So of course the answer eventually my proposal was really about, let's not to do anything to the wall, because the most fundamental question of this whole competition is about the wall as it's left. And so my proposal was really about to say, let's not to do anything to the wall. While all the other proposals was proposing a glass wall, laser wall, curtain steel wall, water wall, all that. And so in a competition, my proposal was say, no, let's not do anything to the wall. Let's spend the money to build public space around the wall. And of course, I did all the trees on this pencil drawing was was surveyed on the site. And then in the place where the wall it's almost invisible, I proposed to dig for 2 meters to expose the huge stone foundations of the wall, and then to propose public spaces that the wall could become a background for the international art festival or design festival for the city of Beijing. By 2001, there was nothing, no events like this imagined by the city. Of course, now there's a design week, which is very active in the city of Beijing. So we won the competition. That's what brought me back from New York. But this gives to do it innovatively. Here, this is, of course, in terms of detail of the landscape, it's not so much exciting, but as public space, there was, in the weekend, you see old people dancing at the corner where in the beginning I proposed outdoor theater. And then this was the one of the page of the competition where the survey of the different conditions of the rough half collapsed wall and people's life around the wall, which is typical of the old city of Beijing, where people, especially in the old city, people really live on the streets. They live on the hutongs, and then the community has always been very alive. And these are a few pictures of the finished project. So now we go, lower right hand corner is the first project that I engaged with the city. That was built in 2003. Unfortunately, after that, for over a decade, I didn't get any projects in the city of Beijing at all. It's only after 2012 that we started to re-engage with the old city. Here is a map of the location. It was this number 2 is the Dashua area. It's only about 1 kilometer it's within walking distance between this area and the Forbidden City. And the Betas area, which I will talk about, the co-living courtyards, and then the Dashla area. And we're also doing a social housing currently in the northeast area. So basically, those are the micro series that we are about to start. Here is a picture of the typical old city of Beijing, looking from the roof. And these were old courtyard houses, but after 1940, end of 1940, it has been evolved into collective living, and which we call it big messy courtyards, which each courtyard would be occupied by a dozen families, very high density. And this is the typical one of a nicer kind of conditions, but this is not one family, it's at least 3-4 different families. It's very beautiful urban fabric, but at the same time has lots of problems, and because the living condition there is really not good. So by the this leads to our first project, Micro UR. Here you can see this the area of the. It's right on the southwest direction of the Forbidden City, and this is the site of the project. One of the it's a typical, very typical. As I introduced, the big messy courtyard. On the lower left, you can see an existing plan, and this courtyard was occupied by more than a dozen families, and some units, each family occupies around 10 to 12 square meter of space, and in the past few decades, they all started to build their own small addition as kitchen. Although it looks really messy, and it was, but the space nevertheless has been very dynamic and attractive. So the typical method, and 99% of the conservation or renewal method, or the official method, is to remove these additions to the lower right hand kind of plan, which was going back for 100 years at least. But this was still considered as the correct approach. But my question was to question that what is our contemporary urban history? These people who have lived in this space for all their life, were those traces of their life and their creation supposed or fated to be erased? Is there a contemporary history of our urban condition? So our proposal here was shown on this early study model, that because these were owned by different families, we were thinking that by redesign, renovate, and reuse some of the existing structures, of which were their own kitchens, and to think if it's possible to create new public and semi-public programs within the courtyard, of course, the most important question was, what is needed? The most fundamental question is, these spaces, do they really need those spaces? Were we proposing something that was only something that we thought is important, and then they don't need it, the neighborhood? So we spent a lot of time trying to think what is missing. We used a children's library, which is 8 square meters, and then we also redesigned a 6 square meter art space that wraps around the big tree. And later we have 2 new bays of this building available. We propose a dancing studio and multi-function space here, a communal kitchen here, an art room here. So altogether, the space is still less than 200 square meters. And here is a model of how the project started to evolve. After around 2 years of study and even plywood mock-up, we start to really build. The first one was, of course, this concrete, inserted concrete little library, 8 square meters. And then this art space and the communal kitchen. In between, there is still one kitchen conserved. It's still owned by one of the residents who still live here. These are some sketches. I will just have to go fast. For this 8 square meter space, I actually spent more time than 10,000 square meter building project, because smaller projects are like playing solo in a concert. If you make any small mistakes, everyone will notice. So all the scales has to fit, both for children and for even adults. And it's interesting that children, they immediately find all different ways to occupy different space in their own way. In the past few years, especially the year before, we organized over 60 events. Almost there was event every week or every other week. Children interact with artists from around the world. Since I don't have too much time, this is paper cutting and some other events of projecting with their own paper cutting. Improvising, music and art. This was before the Halloween. Children of the neighborhoods, they cut recycled cardboard, and then make their own costume and march in the Hutong. So there were many events happened, and then in the design week, there's still a lot of events happening there. And next, I'm going to quickly show a few images of how we brought this project to the exhibition of Venice Biennale in 2016, where which was curated by Aravena, which is also doing a talk here today. I wouldn't spend too much time to explain this installation. And this is the picture taken just last winter. The second, so the first project was really about the layering of historical layers and program. The second project I would like to show is called Micro-Huton. It deals with a new question, a new issue of the old city, which is extremely tight space. This house is only around 40 square meter. So the question is, how do we create a house that is in very tight space, but we want to create it in a new way that we have a few bedrooms, at the same time we have a toilet, and is it possible to create also a courtyard? And all this is within the height limit of the old city. So we call it Micro-Huton. Within this 40 square meter, here a threshold, I think the threshold is one of the topic that we are talking today, homes in the street. So it's a house, it's a hostel at the same time. In the front, there was this formerly indoor space we deliberately designed as a semi-outdoor space, so that communities could and events could happen here. On the back, by stacking or spatially shifting the height of the boxes, we created two living rooms, one study, one toilet, and one dining space. And of course, all the spaces are, we had floor heating, aircon, central aircon, and also the operable skylight for ventilation, etc. So, and we planted 2 trees, and then the trees are growing in the past few years, and then in the future, in a decade, it will become a tiny little house at the foot of a huge tree, which was like the Japanese cartoon Totoro story, I imagine. I wouldn't go too much deep about the details of the projects. I would just quickly show slides. You see the trees start to take over, and then the house will eventually become a house at the foot, all covered under the canopy. The third project is dealing with a more general question. Unlike the second one that has a striking form, and this one is, we were trying to think of what we can do, that this project could be, we can create something that could be applied to every renewal project. This comes to the basic question is, what is the most needed thing for the old city, for the people who live in the old city? So it comes to this Betas area, which we have about 90 square meter existing courtyard. So these people, some of them moved out, and then this courtyard, of course, our answer of what's mostly needed for everyone, every courtyard is the core of a house, which means a toilet, a shower, a kitchen. So instead of creating the form, we are saying that maybe we should create a core that could be inserted to every old houses, be it in Beijing or in any old city around the world. So our proposal here is really more about what we can do about to create a core, to invent a core of a house. So we did this with 4 square meter, which is 2 meter by 2 meter functional core that can fit into every room. So I wouldn't go about the architectural approach here about creating several courtyards and then the existing brick wall with the new concrete and the layering of space which is still there, of history which is still visible. The functional module here is the most important thing. Now the house is rented to a novelist who runs a children's education program. But the core, the functional module here is we developed this, we call it world's smallest core of a house, which has a toilet, a shower, a kitchen, a fridge, everything you need, and then on the top is a king-sized bed. We actually got a patent for this even. So this is the functional core that's built. And this we call co-living courtyard. We didn't want all of these houses to become only for rich people. So in fact, we designed 3 houses within this 90 square meter. One is a bigger house with the core. The other is 10 square meter inserted in this one that's not realized, but it's realized in the next project I'm going to show. So this is the functional module being inserted in another location for the design week for the community. And then the neighborhood actually got very excited testing using of it, the toilet and the kitchen, and they were very interested. And all these are functioning. So last is a few images of our office, which is also in the old, near the old city outskirts. The gray brick renovation from the car repairing factory. I quickly go through the images. You can recognize that this is the space that I'm currently in. And this is my team. You can see we're very young from everywhere of the world. My hair was even shorter. The Chinese name, 标准营造 of our office. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks, Tom and Zhang, for your wonderful presentations. I mean, I think the scale of fineness with which you have both dealt with this question is truly inspiring. And I hope we can have a nice discussion around this. And I can't help but feel, the difference in approach, which partly, I mean, I think you're looking at the same issues, but the kind of approach and the take and the lens is partly for me climatic and cultural. I mean, South Europe kept sort of resonating in my mind. And of course, Zhang, Asia is perhaps so central to your own experiences, lived experiences. In any case, your presentations are absolutely on point in terms of culminating the 4 sessions that precedes today's session in this conference. And I say on point because you've made the questions raised by the organizers land at the smallest architectural scale. See, the conference set its mandate to look at the nature of today's urbanism at 4 distinct scales and thresholds that define public spaces in our cities. Cities, commons, neighborhoods, and the doorstep, and how they relate to each other. So you really have brought us to the delicacy kind of the doorstep or the threshold we cross every day and are often not even mindful of the symbolism of what they do or could kind of potentially denote. And I think this is really fascinating how you've both addressed it in such powerful ways. In fact, as a point of entry and exit, a threshold, and I'm now using the word threshold because both your presentations evoke that, has a dual coding in society as both a physical and symbolic marker of separation and connection. Thresholds are often explicitly hard-edged or even brutal in their expression, demarcating rigid boundaries, as in the definitive lines of walls or barricades and security checkpoints in buildings, swipe card readers, and this is happening around the world, around cities and across larger territories. So too often thresholds actually divide human activity or communities according to social, ethnic, national, or economic characteristics. So, I mean, for us as architects in architecture and planning, what we have to be aware of is that thresholds can unwittingly contribute to these different forms of physical separation, especially in ways made visible through their practitioners' interpretation of culture, religion, and even legislative modulations. And so I think we really become sometimes unknowingly, often knowingly, co-opted in the process of constructing, softening, or hardening thresholds. And by extension, I was just thinking, because you both seem to, in very interesting ways, cross these boundaries, because the academic disciplines that inform spatial practices, architecture and planning themselves, often similarly separated by disciplinary thresholds, inhibit porosity between fields of research. And so, I mean, I couldn't but help think of that as you both spoke, because I saw you both sort of going across this, although your vocabularies perhaps were situated more in one discipline. And so by definition, any individual discipline is necessarily organized around a self-referential center of discursive production. But this often happens at the expense of the richness found at the intersection of multiple disciplinary perspectives. And again, I found your presentations going together made me sort of cross across those perspectives continuously. Is architecture, would be the question, in its compulsive drive to create the autonomous object, inherently hardening the threshold, separating it from the other disciplines, and by extension, reproducing those schisms within the built environment, And I think, Tom, really at the scale of the building, I read that sort of in many of the things that you said in your observations. And so, can architecture and planning intentionally construct soft thresholds, lines that are easily traversed, even temporarily erased, thereby allowing for multiple perspectives across different modes of research and practice, catalyzing disciplinary and social connections? And I think, Zhang, in your project, as a practitioner, I mean, you kind of almost answered all those questions. So then what then is the physical expression of these soft thresholds, a space that's visually and physically porous, plural in spirit, encompassing of its context, embracing its context, Tom, to kind of paraphrase some of your intended messages, and yet rigorous in its expression. And I think that's why, I think from the examples you showed us, and then Zhang, the way you demonstrate this, I mean, I think we see that rigor in addressing these perhaps complex challenges for us as designers. I think Tom and Zhang, you both demonstrated, one through rigorous observation and research, and the other through the dissipating of these thresholds that make for, I think, socially richer and more robust communities. And I think this has really been a fantastic treat. Tom, it's absolutely fascinating how you've taken one element, the balcony, and used it as a lens and implied its instrumentality to connect the individual to society, but also the evolution of that architectural typology from the function to the stylistic. I mean, I was amused because one hadn't thought about that, is its origins in the early days were really defense. They were performative and in a sense, and fortified and dangerous in what they were read as. And how that is sort of now changed and it's become something about embracing society. It's become open. It's become the opposite of defense. In fact, it's become its willing susceptibility to embrace larger communities. And that's very poetic if you kind of think about it. And the notion that it also becomes a venue for politics, for the co-production of the city, I think was a wonderful moment in your presentation. Thank you for that insight. And as you said, I'm just sort of recapping some for the audience, that citizens around the world have searched for alternative ways to appear in the public sphere, for other modes of meeting one another, other tactics to share and support. And you recognize the digital sphere has offered many new encounter, exchange, and collaborative spaces, but also in our analog world, in our neighborhoods and cities, just to go to point on the conference's questions, alternative ways of doing have been developed. And you focus our point on one architectural element that has played a key role. And that's, I think, something we should be thankful to you for. The balcony, a personal podium of collectivity, private parlor of public presence, an individual lighthouse of the commons, as you call it. And I think you've connected the historic perspective to the present or the pandemic condition we are living in. And I think that's very productive. And I hope we can have a conversation around that. Zanke, for me, you really covered so many issues. I'm not even sure where to start. Clearly for me, you answered, I think, the questions that this conference has been grappling with in the last 4 sessions about how at scales these thresholds can be blurred, but you also touched upon many other things. Clearly for me, a few stood out and resonate perhaps with the condition that I work in India, that many of our audiences deal with, but also elsewhere globally. First of all, your work for me is deeply political. It is about showing other ways of imagining how society can spatially be organized to have a clearer sense of community. And I mean, I think this is central to, let's say, the mandate of the architect, really. And so I think even the first project you showed us, by just asking that question, actually opened up new possibilities. And so you really make instrumental, in a sense, the role of the architect, and so what society has invested in us to imagine better spatial possibilities. And in your work, you kind of address, and I use this carefully because it's it's maybe an overused jargon, but you use the notion of acupuncture in terms of strategy, micro renewals, and conservation simultaneously. They're two sides of the same coin in the way you kind of demonstrate it, renovation, repair. And you show us an entire spectrum of how you can formulate a threshold and how spatially one can negotiate the inside, outside, public, private, and a whole range of conditions which go beyond those sort of simplistic binaries. And interestingly and powerfully, you have demonstrated this at the finest scale. And more importantly, these are resources that you have also deployed with the same precision as the way you've made the architecture. And I think that is also, an important embedded lesson. And I think most importantly, you've put the human being at the center of all these preoccupations in terms of imagining how space is occupied, at what scale, and at what scale those interactions actually make communities. I'm also fascinated and impressed by how spatially and putting things together have traveled across a range of issues, from the interventions in the hutongs to the 40 square meter house, with the core, the idea of the core, which also has huge implications, and also with cultural infrastructure being embedded in all these propositions. So it's always about bringing people together. And so again, I think that's beautifully posed in the center. And, you know, and looking at your work, I couldn't but help think of everything we are grappling with in India, with slum integration and upgradation, and working at densities where sometimes just micro interventions that form community become an amenity that allows for other forms of change, which are triggered off by sometimes just a very incisively placed intervention. So thank you for that. And thank you again on behalf of this audience for what you've shared with us. So Tom, I'm kind of going to jump in and ask you the first question, and then there are a couple of questions that have come up which, you know, for you. So let's engage with that. Maybe we can go back and forth a little bit. You know, Tom, in contemporary architecture and urban development, elements like balconies are treated as standardized, peripheral, often slapped on. You showed us the idea of kitsch. And of course, you also talked about situating the importance in the present context, really within the frame of an anti-urban discourse related to COVID. And you talked about the green, you talked about social, I mean, all the things people are actually attacking the urban for. You saw that this one margin can be elastic enough to respond to that, which was wonderful. But if one actually, you know, extends it a little further, and you know, thinks about it typologically, and I'm interested in this also because of your work with Rem Koolhaas, where elements, balcony was one, but how does one situate it in the broader landscape? And I'm going to pick up on a question and connect what I was going to ask, because I think a question comes in really on point. It's a question from Dennis Piper's writing from Boston, where he kind of says, Aldo van Eyck spoke about the in-between, which the balcony perfectly captures. How can this notion be projected to other scales in the city, an element of the city, and not just the building?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I do think indeed that the balcony is one of these in-between spaces. We call them threshold spaces. This is a notion that we've used nowadays, and of course there are many threshold spaces. I mean, the door could be another one, or the doorstep, as Van Eyck was talking about as well. For me, I mean, the balcony, it's true that it's an element which is on the level of the single building, let's say. But for me, and I hope that also came a bit across in my talk of today, I think it's very important that for me, the balcony is also a mediator, let's say, between the urban scale, I would say, and the scale of the building, between the house and the city. But it is, of course, an interesting question. Could this also be, as it were, upscaled, and could this be taught at a bigger scale of the city? And personally, I have been thinking a bit about that. I think that there are indeed at certain moments, certain zones in city that fulfill this threshold role. And one of the reasons why I, next to being very interested in the balcony, have also been interested in what we call commons in the city. I'm, for instance, thinking about the Boston Commons as one of the most well-known examples of such a common in the North American sphere. Is that these spaces, they also fulfill a very particular function in the city. What sort of a function did they fulfill? At one time, they were used for military activities. At the other time, they were used for agriculture. At another time, they were used for very official gatherings, let's say. At other moments, for very leisurely gatherings. And I think that for me, that would be, in some kind of way, the equivalent, if I may say so, of what the balcony is doing on a very small scale level. So these commons, for me, they are spaces in the city that people can appropriate in various ways for more indeed private uses, for more public uses, for more individual small-scale groupings, and for bigger collective groupings. So I see some kind of a resonance there. You know, of course, that if I really would need to answer with Aldo van Eyck, then I would name, of course, his playgrounds, because I think that Aldo van Eyck's playgrounds in the city of Amsterdam, they are really an example of where such a spaces where this can become a sort of bigger urban space. And you know that this had a great impact also in the immediate post-war period on Amsterdam, because Van Eyck, talking about acupuncture, I mean, Van Eyck was indeed inserting a very large amount of these playgrounds in the city of Amsterdam as a strategy of urban development, let's say, immediately after the post-war period, but also as spaces, though they were called playgrounds, that didn't only play a role for children, but for the community at large, let's say. So they could be used for playing, but also for meeting of the citizens in the city. So that would be the Van Eyck answer. But my own answer would be a bit more on the level of the commons, let's say. I think we still need to preserve these kind of spaces in the city, like the Boston Commons used to be, where there's a variety of uses ranging from agriculture to military activities, if you want to, all having a place in the city.
Thank you. No, thank you, Tom. That was very helpful. And I just sort of want to extend it from, and put on board a question that comes from Kush Parekh, and I'm not sure where in India, but somewhere in India, which says, majority of projects that you are alluding to, naturally the balcony evolved in this kind of mid-rise, high density, high income group housing. And what are the implications? Because it's also very typologically linked to the apartment and things. And are there any clues that we could get from it to include balconies in affordable high density housing? And in a sense, I think, Kush, this is partly answered by what Zhang showed you, because he showed you how actually that becomes an interpretation. But I'm curious if Tom might want to add to this question of typology and form.
Yeah, maybe, of course, I will then pass the word to Zhang as well, because I agree that he showed as an architect, as a designer, how to do that. What I can answer is that the projects that I've been showing, the majority of the projects that I've been showing, they were actually what we call in Europe social housing. So this means housing for the masses, for the, I would say, the lower middle income people, houses that were heavily subsidized by the state. And this was true for the housing that I've shown in Europe, but also in North Africa, by the way, in Algiers and in Morocco. What I do think is very important, and this was somewhere in the middle of my lecture, is that these balconies, they at a certain moment, they disappeared from the social housing in Europe. And why was that? Because these balcony spaces, they were not taken very serious, not very taken very serious by the legislators, because they were looked upon as sort of auxiliary space, marginal space, something that was added to the real living space, let's say. And that's why you then suddenly see this high-rise housing emerging without balconies at all. Let's say I showed one image of Le Créteil in France. So, and strangely enough, of course, again, what we saw right now in the COVID period were two things. First of all, that people rediscovered these balconies for doing all kinds of activities, as I've shown, but also that the housing, that this was also creating inequality, because not everybody has access to a balcony, let's say, and exactly in the more poorer areas, let's say, you would find these high-rise housing without balconies, let's say. So I think what I'm trying to say, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a lengthy answer, but what I'm trying to say is that it's very important that within the standards, within the norms that we define for low-cost housing, that these outdoor spaces, they are fully incorporated, fully taken seriously, let's say as well, because that's something that we've seen decline when we look at European cases. I will maybe leave it and pass on to Zhang.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. So Zhang, I'm going to just come in with some questions, and you can also extend what Tom said. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Add on Tom's, it's this topic of balconies. So I agree with you so much, because as you know, I was just out of this 14 days of quarantine in Shanghai in a room without a balcony. I was really craving for a semi-outdoor space, and that's, I think, somehow the regulation in around the world should consider this new situation of pandemic, that we do need that, because there's chance that we are going to be locked inside that one small apartment. So I was designing new housing with like much deeper balcony now.
Thank you.
Yes, so it's really
Zhang,
relevant.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump into a couple of questions for you, and then we'll come back to Tom if we have time. I just sort of want to start with actually a very broad question, maybe a bit vague, but what inspired you to do these micro series? Because it's a real shift in scale, and hutongs were not paid attention when you were doing this. And so what compelled you to work with these micro interventions when China was really thinking big? And then these spatial modulations that you make of blurred conditions, did you draw on cultural specific lessons? I mean, what took you to this point?
This is a long story, almost more than 25 years long story. It started with my thesis. Actually, it was a graduate master degree thesis. It said, Charles Correa's theory on architecture and urban design, the Enlightenment to China, was so I studied it was my professor then, Professor Wu Liangyong, and also Professor Hu Shaoxue. They lent me 2 books of Charles Correa for me to study around 1995. 94. So, and then I studied the book of the New Landscape. I still remember there was one part that Charles was proposing a sidewalk in Mumbai where people can actually sleep on the sidewalk with a platform that people could sleep there, and also then they're not homeless people. They're people that could that goes to the office to work. So they have a storage and shower. They put all these things there. So those things are so inspiring, and then to think of the people who has that need. And then the second part of my thesis then back in Tsinghua was how we can be inspired to the topic of the city of renewal of Beijing. And then, of course, the topic, one of the statements was the housing for Beijing is the result. The answer was not big panels of buildings and towers. The sum up of that is the solution. So the high density and all that issue. So it does relate to Charles Correa. And then I came back to Beijing, and then there was so much discussion about conservation, but it's so much controlled by the real estate developers, which always want to build 3 times more spaces, and also the same kind of kitsch of restoring fake historical things. Those are the 2 extremes. So I always think that if we do learn if I do learn from the work that I did 25 years ago, that I have to take some action. So that's how the first 2 projects was not, we were not paid. We have to pay rent to get the opportunity to do that. And we find friends to put money into it. So it's all self
initiated. Yes.
Initiated. Yeah.
No, thank you. No, that's just interesting to hear. But I just also, for the audience, want to flag out, and for our speakers, it's interesting that you bring up this proposal for the hawkers in the arcade that Charles Correa made, it was actually discussed in the first session by Ranjit Hoskote. And I think, Tom, when you brought up Aldo Van Eyck to Dennis Piper's question, Liane Lefebvre did a whole presentation in the second session on the playgrounds of Aldo Van Eyck. And so it's interesting that I think as part of the discussion of the conference, this notion of the Nessel scales keep coming back, because one can't but help refer to them across scales. And I think that's a successful conversation. So Zanki, I want to put a question that has come from Prem from India, which says, it's a question for you, which says, Le Corbusier's statement house that a machine for living, that the statement that a house is a machine for living is commonly misunderstood as cold logic, when it is a highly poetic statement. The first time he said it in reference to the 70 square meter house he designed for his parents, where, because he saw it as a machine, it could be seen as a kit of parts. And if you introduce transparency across the components in a 70 square meter house, you could have a promenade. You seem to be pursuing the notion of a promenade within small projects without deploying the metaphor of a machine. Is there a metaphor or a worldview that is enabling this?
I understand this statement, house as the machine for living, was a statement that works very well in that specific historical moment, where people don't believe that house could be a machine. But I think now we are in a moment. But the other aspect is to always to think for the people, the emotional part aspect of people. I think, but now even the connotation of machine has to, the machine, we were using the word machine learning. So even the machines start to have humanized characters. Of course, I think emotion, the how to bring it humane. Even we go back to this Charles Correa's proposal for the sidewalk that provide people to sleep. I think it's the center. In our time, I think this is, for me, the most basic question is, how do we design better for people? For actually, that's going to be always relevant. And then our need is not just the physical need, which is these things, which is necessary, but that's definitely not enough. So I think the core of that house, our idea is, after we have this smallest core of a house, which when you have a kitchen, when you have a toilet, when you have a bed on top, then you have a house. The wrapping could be anything. I think, but that could fit but the wrapping is important. So because you can have a light, you can have a view, you can have your own privacy, etc. But so we have the machine. That's why we can forget about the machine. So we can get one step further. That's what I care more about.
Thank you, Zanke. So I think we are running out of time, but I'm just going to kind of end it with a couple of comments. And Tom, there's one question for you, because I kind of want to bring it back to the pandemic. It's the elephant in the room one can't avoid, and everything seems to come back to it. But I think your historic lessons about the balcony, and I think you tried answering what the relevance might be for today. It really is this tension also in architecture, where the projection of the balcony really has to work against the surface of the architecture, which architects get obsessive about, and every style has kind of dealt with it in some way. And so that's an interesting tension that you, I think, outlined. And I think, what Zanke showed us was, it's like the inside-out paradigm. No, the Palladian villa gets its symmetry from the surfaces on the exterior, whereas the Asian house gets its symmetry from the courtyard within. It's the space within, which Zanke has very bravely and skillfully, in a sense, disrupted positively, right? So I think in these cultural paradigms, there are different sorts of issues in how. So he's created the balcony inside, and therefore it's given him another kind of freedom to even separate it from the architecture. Whereas in the Western paradigm, using the Palladian villa emblematically, it's about disruption because it's rupturing the surface of calmness. And I think this sort of thanks to Nandita, I think this is a great pairing you put together, because it kind of explosively opens up contextual, cultural, and paradigmical kind of, whatever the word might be, differences in a very, very interesting way. I'm just going to ask you one last question. It's more information. It comes from Mark Angeli to you, Tom. Since you were addressing the current pandemic, I was wondering whether in the 1918 Spanish influenza potentially contributed to the change in attitude that you briefly mentioned at the beginning of your lecture concerning the use of balconies from the 19th to the 20th century.
Oh, it's a very good question. I need to say yes, of course, because much of the, let's say, the hygienic thinking in urban design is a result of bigger pandemics which took place in indeed the, let's say, the centuries prior to the 20th century. So what I try to express to you is that in the beginning of the 20th century, why this balcony was so warmly embraced, you could say, by the modern movement in architecture, was especially because they believed that this would bring improved hygienic conditions, improved living conditions, and these should be indeed positioned against the background of previous pandemics, diseases, of the sort of the well-known miasma theories, which have influenced, of course, urban design and urban planning in a very strong way. So that's a very good remark, which wasn't part of my historic overview, but which should certainly be included in that. But what I think is maybe the interesting and the provocative part of the question is that this might make us think about what now the future might be of the balcony, let's say as well, because we are, as we all can notice, living this pandemic. Zhang was saying that he was indeed 2 weeks in isolation, let's say, and this must, I think, make us rethink as architects, as urban designers, about these threshold spaces, both inside of the building when I'm looking at or inside of the courtyard when I'm looking at the work of Zhang, and I think outside of the building, looking at balconies and other threshold spaces as well.
Thank you very much, Tom. And, I just thought, because you kind of ended with the pandemic, the question was a good bookend, in a sense, to open it up. So thank you, Mark, for that. And, really in closing, just to say that these are such different paradigms which have implications, even if you look at it through and interrogate it through the lens of the pandemic, because what Zhang showed us is you could actually disaggregate community in modules within the courtyard typology, which has a big implication on the public, even if one has to deal with public health, versus an outward-facing city, which allows different forms of disaggregation, doesn't actually allow that much disaggregation. So thank you both for these kind of complementary interventions. It's a wonderful bookending also of the conference, just through the references, but also in the way, as I said in the beginning, you precisely landed on point at a scale that the conference had aspired to, which is the scale of the threshold. So thank you both very much. Now we move to the last part of the conference, of this almost 5-part conference, and this is the closing keynote. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Alejandro Aravena, who will deliver this closing keynote for the conference today. Alejandro is based in Chile, where in 2006 he became the executive director of Elemental, a for-profit company with social interests. It's not a not-for-profit, but it's a profit company, but with social interests. The mind of a professional and the heart of an NGO. In July 2015, Aravena was named the director of the architecture section of the Venice Biennale, with the responsibility of curating the 15th International Architecture Exhibition, which was held in Venice in 2016. Zhang also participated in it, and I must say I had the great pleasure of also being part of this, and so I saw Aravena's thinking and the kinds of issues that he kind of brought to an international forum. Aravena has been recognized with many, many awards. I don't want to use up the time outlining them, but his most recent and perhaps most prestigious one has been the Pritzker Prize in 2016. In fact, for me, what makes Alejandro stand out is his commitment to leverage this position, skills, all of that in service of basic societal questions, which is not to say it undermines his architectural production or serious commitment to the craft of architecture. But I would say, and I would say this with some conviction, that among a pantheon of Pritzker Prize winners, he's among the very few who has had that commitment in a real and sustained way. He's almost like two people in one. A commitment where he's had his ear to the ground and followed, just yesterday in a community development conference that I was part of as part of my department at the school, I heard someone say that it's critical to follow the 4 L principles. And the L principles are, and he's followed them, which is to listen, to learn, and then to leverage, which is leverage your networks, because it allows you in Arjun Apudurai's model of deep democracy to negotiate between the grassroots and more powerful forces. And that's the leverage that status, training, recognition can give you. But then the last L, which is critical, is to launch. That is to launch into solutions to make it happen. And I think Alejandro really, when I was listening to this yesterday, I thought, my God, what a fantastic way to describe Alejandro's work tomorrow. For him, societal transformation is not a theoretical, grounded and real. So while he's, I would think, and I'm using this hesitatingly because it has baggage with it, but he's a utopian visionary, but he's also a critical realist. His projects are a testimony. The half house is a perfect example where the utopian streak does not compromise the size and safety and technical integrity of the house, but gives you half upfront, compromising for all those good things the other half. But it's an act of optimism and one of engagement and the faith in the fact that the resident will grow the house to completion. I don't want to spend time describing or listing his projects, but rather I'm going to read a tribute that a mutual friend of ours, Hashim Sarkis, wrote on his announcement of the Pritzker Prize for Aravena. And so to quote Sarkis, Alejandro's approach does not produce a diagram or a party, but more of a formula or an equation. He often presents his designs as solutions to equations. These equations usually explain volumetric, not planimetric relationships. Through his interrogation process, Aravena leaps from program to a constitution of other possibilities of inhabitation than the one he or the inhabitants started with. What you thought you wanted is not what you get. You wanted a playground, but you get a cascading landscape. You wanted a nursery, you get an overblown building blocks. You wanted a detached house, you end up with an attached half house. The forms, emphasis, this unexpected outcome. They always seem to have landed from somewhere else, disheveled, tentative, but bold, slightly off scale and off key in their materiality, unquote. In the opening discussions of this conference on 1st September, which celebrated Charles Correa's 90th birth anniversary, Ranjit Hoskote had offered us the rubric, which he called the guests from the future. He used it to speak about Fuller, Correa, Gandhi. I would add Alejandro to this list, someone who shares with us ways to dream, to hope, and to imagine a better future with immense possibilities. We could not have had a better closing keynote speaker than Alejandro Aravena. It is a wonderful closing, and it's a wonderful tribute we are paying to Charles Correa on his 90th anniversary. We are grateful that he has chosen to share with us a project which is not known publicly as it's recent. So we are privileged to see these new ideas in formulation and formation. And with that, I would like to welcome Alejandro to deliver his keynote talk titled A Bridge, a Park, and a Bank All in One. Alejandro.
Well, thank you so much for this introduction. I'm a little bit afraid though, after all this appraisal, now no pressure. I mean, what if I deliver a very bad speak about this project? Well, in any case, thank you for your generosity and for the invitation. I do agree from the introduction, the power of synthesis of architecture. The more complex the problem, the more the need for synthesis. So in that sense, I guess that to listen and learn from what you've just said, and very interesting to describe a process. So you just shut up and expect reality to inform the form that you will eventually have to produce afterwards. So organize information in a proposal key, I guess it's at the very core of architecture, and there's a big need, given the complexity of cities, to try to organize all that information in this proposal key, at least because projects are going to be difficult, are going to be in conflict. That conversations at the city level become more productive the moment there's a proposal on the table. If you just focus on the diagnosis, it's very hard to achieve agreements and to move ahead. And I guess there's a big role in architecture given the times that we're living. And the case for the Inter-American Development Bank in Buenos Aires, Argentina, may be one small example of that, trying to address complex issues in a very specific operation. In this case, actually a building or a park, an infrastructure, in addition to just this, the headquarters, regional headquarters for the Inter-American Development Bank. So what you're looking at, it's a photograph of Barrio 31, which is the biggest slum in Buenos Aires.
You might need to start the
yeah, I think it's coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, technology is not really my thing, and I forget to mention to the team that
put the PowerPoint up.
PowerPoint should be on, but I guess it's on now, right? Yeah. You can see that. Yeah. So this is a small scale Dharavi situation where you have a slum just in front of the richest neighborhood of Buenos Aires, in this case called Recoleta. Of course, the small scale, it's relative. I mean, it's not 1 million people, but 50,000 people. Nevertheless, it's a huge informal settlement. We in Chile don't have the experience of such a large scale yet. It's a common issue in Latin American cities where the workforce of the formal city has to be as close as possible. And that's why people came to city, actually, looking for opportunities that cities concentrate of better jobs, better education, access to healthcare, recreation and transportation. But being land a scarce resource, then they tend to locate themselves as close as possible, but normally in very bad living conditions, not to mention no access to basic services. I actually remember what you've just said in a conversation some months ago where, Rahul, you said that the house is the only vaccine that we know nowadays against the pandemic. Yet, for the very simple recommendation of health authorities that stay at home and wash your hands, well, for many people, that's not even a possibility. If there's no house, there's no running water. And that's the case for a slum like this. Yet, the closeness to an expectation of improving your life forces people to live for decades in very bad living conditions. And that's the case for this slum, Barrio 31. We were called by the Inter-American Development Bank that was already investing in improving the slum condition. In the World Bank financing and IDB financing, they were bringing sewage, water, and trying to improve living conditions of the people. And around that time, the bank was looking to build a new headquarters in Buenos Aires. And if they had followed business as usual, they could have built a tower and make an investment and a financial operation in the formal city, just as any other business district and company would have done. But the president of the bank said, well, it's true that we're a bank, but we are a development bank. So shouldn't we be doing our own building and trying to test if it's able to trigger the same amount of development that we ask for the projects that we finance? So they began to study, what if we place the building, the bank's headquarters inside the slum, inside Barrio 31? And there were a set of conditions, and in the listening part, we were listening and trying to understand, what does the bank need to work? How many meetings, who they meet with, how often, what's the scale of meetings, how does it operate, since it's not a conventional bank? And just to give an example, they were having 250 meetings with ministers or presidents where they come to the bank, or the bank presents them alternatives for financing projects. So meeting was important. And after listening, I would say for a couple of weeks, we came to the conclusion, and we said this to the client, that the expected development they wanted to trigger, if they placed the bank inside the slum, was not going to happen. It would have been a gesture. It may have remained as a white elephant, but if you measured how many new activities would have been brought into the slum if you just place and make this big thing land into the neighborhood, would not trigger the desired development. So to our own, I mean, we were very sad to say, look, we may lose this project, but it's not going to be a good thing if you just place a building inside the slum. We were looking at the slum, and you may all know what it looks like. This had some slight different conditions. It's rather high, so 4, 5, up to 6 stories. So it's a very dense neighborhood. Public open space was the scarcest resource. There was a very important highway, the one that actually leads to the very core of Buenos Aires. It's running on top of this slum. And this is the one that comes from the local airport. And you see there the height of the buildings, it's more or less the same height of the highway. And people living not just close to this infrastructure, but actually even underneath or in between the highway that is running on top. 50% of the population of this slum is immigrants from neighboring countries, people coming for better living conditions. And this is the kind of occupation that you may encounter while visiting this neighborhood. You see the stairs, that may be a kind of universal feature. An external vertical circulation element that allows for properties. The first generation of informal settlers may have built on the ground floor, then they rent and build first and put a stair and rent a second story of illegal occupation, and a third and a fourth, so on and so forth. You see there the very fragile and poor infrastructure, wires, access to electricity, yet whole families are here looking for better ways of living, a better future. So one of the particular aspects of this slum is that this 50,000 people neighborhood has just one single entry and access point in the very north, close to the main train station, and actually it's known as the Retiro train station, where the arrow is pointed there. So it's a bottleneck that every people has to go through in and out. People have to walk to their jobs, and within 1 hour is where those jobs are. The highway was identified by the government and the plans as one of the barriers that had to be eliminated if they wanted to improve living conditions. There were safety issues and the closeness, and particularly those living underneath the highway. So there's a plan to remove the highway and transform it into a kind of highline, an elevated public space that is, as I was saying, the scarcest resource in this settlement, and it's going to be relocated. But what we thought was the more important barrier that had to be eliminated is described actually by the city as a river of trains. What made it impossible for the people to access easily those jobs that are on the other side of this river of trains was the fact that there was no connection. Everybody had to walk to that very end and then go back to the formal city. And this is the moment where, well, can we do something with our own headquarters and put it in the neighborhood? And as I was describing, we were prepared to lose the job by recommending that that would not be a good idea. It wouldn't, well, or let's put it this way. We said to them, unless you ask for the city for 4 conditions under which the project may eventually produce the desired development. First one is to elevate the building, not put it on the ground level, and this even to comply with the standards. The bank main headquarters are in Washington. They do have to follow a certain standards and procedures in terms of natural light, ventilation, views for the working conditions for the staff. So it would have required to be elevated, and that was not within the, let's say, the new set of rules for the master plan for the neighborhood improvement that the World Bank was financing. So it would have to create a special rule to be able to be on top of the existing built fabric. It also would be desirable not to occupy what is most valuable in the neighborhood, which is open space. There was a very narrow green area, one of the few available there, and it would have been a pity if only open green space would have been occupied by the bank. So in case you want to come, we said, one condition would be do not touch the ground, put it on top and above at a certain height. Most importantly, there was the need for car connection. I mean, if not, your customers, your staff is not going to be able to even come to work. And the bank may make this gesture, but fail in the everyday operation. And finally, it would be necessary that the city builds a pedestrian connection to public transportation on the other side of the railroads, so that people can go back and forth between the formal city and the new bank. So the problem with that is that the city had no capacity, no money, not even a jurisdiction to be able to build all these conditions that the bank would have required to work. And that's where we recommended not to do the building unless, and that was the tipping point in the process, we said, unless, what if the building, instead of asking for these 4 conditions, what if the building itself is the 4 conditions? What if instead of putting a building inside the slum, we build a pedestrian bridge with the bank that connects both ends? In that sense, one of the ends is going to be in the formal city. Parking, streets don't have to be built. Access to public transportation is going to be there. But then given you're connecting both, then you will have to go up. You have to deliver a clearance for the trains and plus the new highway. So we had to be 18 meters above, and staff will have to achieve that height with some mechanical means. Well, why don't you open those means and allow the people from the neighborhood to use them, so the bank itself may give for free use what they need for themselves and create that communication. In addition to that, we were working with this German structural engineers from SBP. We have been working in other projects, and we're talking about a 240-meter long bridge with 110-meter span in the center. We couldn't touch the rails underneath, so structurally speaking, in addition to the 240 meter long structure, the toughest part was the center with 110 meters long span. And the engineers said, well, we can do that. It's not that difficult. It will depend on the height. So that's why we were thinking that the bank should be within the structure in the height that is required to cover that span. The problem, they said, is not going to be the structure, the span, but the vibration. You may not notice that when you're crossing a bridge with your car, because your own car has a suspension system, but in a bridge you will notice that, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. So they said, for avoiding that, and this is counterintuitive, we need weight. And in order to add the needed weight to the structure, we said, well, what if we put a park on top of the structure? And that weight was able actually in the modeling to dissolve the vibration, but also added square meters that are the most valuable for not only the city in general, but particularly for the slum. So while using the pedestrian bridge on top of the railways, you would be able to have these views in a city that is rather flat. Buenos Aires, it's almost on ground zero. There's no geography going above. So the public, being in a public condition with these views around was going to be a novel thing. And so this was our counter proposal to the bank. To our surprise, the bank immediately saw that here, even though it was not even close to what they were looking for, rationally studying it, this would trigger the desired development. Actually, they measured it, and the existing condition was that within 1 hour, which was the case for the 50,000 people living in the slum, the access to those opportunities that cities concentrate: health, 3 institutions, education, 165, culture and recreation, and in general, for the qualification of the workers, let's say 300,000 job places. When building the bridge, because of the shortcut that we were providing, we did that same hour. People that is so poor that they cannot even afford public transportation. So by walking, the access of jobs was multiplied by 4 to health institutions, education, culture. So the value creation, and this was the kind of study that the bank, by submitting the project to the same parameters they use for the projects they finance, was able to prove to the board that it made sense to make such an unexpected move. And this is how the project began to move ahead, to be developed. It was not a very easy sell. You can imagine, go to Washington and tell people that this was going to be the place from this time on where they were going to work. But that was not exactly true, but because this is at the pedestrian level and because of the clearance for the trains, and we had to be plus 18 meter. And this is what begins to appear at plus 18. And once you frame that with the building, I guess this was the moment where we, in the room that where we're presenting in the board, very impressive kind of UN board meeting room in Washington, we heard this kind of relief of people, no, okay, that's fine. We may be able to go ahead with that. They were a little bit afraid. But then when you begin to show the benefits, not just for the 200, 300 workers of the bank themselves, but for 50,000 people, if not more, and how they benefit both the rich city and the informal city from this more amicable exchange and a way on a daily basis to go from home to work and back, and also experiencing finally some quality of the formal city that they have been segregated from. Was the moment where the project began to win momentum. So So this is how the project was expected to look like. Luckily for us, we were landing on the other side on Buenos Aires Convention Center. So even part of the programs that the bank was expecting to hold inside the bank could not be redundant and duplicated and could take advantage of the existing infrastructure of the city. There was only one big work to be done, which is to modify a law in the Congress in Argentina to be able to use the air rights above the railway. I mean, the city was able to invest in the slum that their jurisdiction allowed them to put money, but the railway space is a national, let's say federal land, it's not city land. That's why, and of course, we would have never even considered to have to go to vote in the Congress, a new law to be able to make a project feasible, particularly in Argentina, where there's a history of fight in between the presidency and the government of the nation and the government of the city. There's always been antagonical political parties, so they tend to block initiatives. So we discussed with the bank and try to agree, are we willing to take the risk and bring this project to the voting on the Congress? And because of some surveys the bank was conducting, there could have been a 2-vote advantage, because for the first time in Argentina, we had a window of opportunity of 2 years where the president and the mayor of the city were of the same coalition. So we may have had this 2-vote advantage. We went to present to the Congress in the first hearing and in the second hearing, and to our surprise, the project was approved. The new law for using air rights was approved, 42 in favor, 12 against. And against, that's the kind of forces that architecture is able to channel instead of resisting or replacing. I mean, if you understand or are able to demonstrate a gain for everybody, well, the city may create alliances that in policy and politics may be less likely in a conventional scenario. And I would say, going back to the other 2 L's that Rahul was mentioning, this is, I would say, the power of design that is able to channel and find agreements. Of course, not always, but these moments eventually may appear. And we hope that of course, we're in times that are very complicated, new presidency in Argentina, the pandemic, and a new president for the bank just being elected in Washington, and we'll see. But that still, at this point, this project, I guess I was able in a very specific operation, concentrated in space, try to understand the bigger picture and hopefully introduce an outcome that was not necessarily what everybody was expecting. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro.
Just hold on.
Now, we ready?
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you very much for that treat. No, it's a fascinating project. And, I think I'm glad I used those words to describe you. And in this case, one can add to that to say, asked for a bank and got a park. So you've been consistent with the surprises that you have been springing on us in very positive ways. And, I think what sort of struck me very much watching your presentation was, how it actually resonates, because the components of a freeway, a favela or a slum, a train track, the downtown as a mirage on the other side, which you can see but you can't get to, the dislocation between places of livelihoods and living and the conditions of living. I mean, these are the components that are making up a majority of our emerging cities. and to use the the description that of course was invented in Bangladesh by a photographer of the notion of the majority world, where a majority of the world's population live, rather than the global north and south, which really we don't quite know what it means. But the majority world, where the majority of the world's population lives, I think your project is almost emblematic of all the components that architects would need to deal with, and so I think the resonance from that perspective is very powerful. I want to kind of put on the table 2 or 3 observations, and then we could maybe discuss them, and I would love to see how you respond to some of those. The first is, I think, a question which a scholar called Devesh Kapoor once posed to me, and as an architect, and he said, if you ask the question how the state should look architecturally, what would you say? Because architecture makes the state intimidating. So he was describing little courthouses in small towns, which are these intimidating buildings. But he said if they were around a courtyard, almost like how Zhang showed us, then people even coming to court, the whole relationship between the judge and the people for justice, sometimes on petty things, would be quite different, right? So I think this is a big question for us in the majority world, is what should the state look like? Because we're even questioning the role of the state. And I think architecture can be an interesting instrument in manifesting this. And of course, there were many, lessons from the project, which were very consistent with the conversation of the conference, which is stretching and in this case, you've really stretched the threshold. You've stretched it both as a performative kind of instrument, but also stretched it to connect and to make porous space for a much, much wider population in the city. So it's another form of threshold, in a sense, if you can imagine it like that, which I think is wonderful. And these are just sort of observations. But I mean, I think for me, the critical question, which I would like to, get some insights from you about is I start with the idea that architect as activists, right? So we use that very loosely, architect as activists, and it could mean anything from standing on a soapbox and shouting in the streets to actually convincing someone. But I mean, I think it's very important through projects like this to understand it. And I think for me, that understanding, again, I refer to Arjun Apodurai's Deep Democracy, where he describes, in a sense, civil society as this in-between part of society, which I think we are all part of, trade unions are part of, any collective that safeguards the common interest perhaps is a part of. And civil society is blessed with its ability through training and privilege perhaps to make a connection between the grassroots and more powerful forces and be very much part of that negotiation, right? In the way you were describing, talking to people in the bank and trying to convince them, but you had a pulse for what you saw and listened and learned. And so maybe for architects, civil society is the new form of patronage we should look at, rather than aligning it to ends of the spectrum where we only result in conditions of polarization. And I think what you could have easily taken the project into a situation of polarization by, converting a building there into an office, and maybe the officials won't have been able to reach their office when people protested, but it won't make sense. So I think that's one question which is of patronage. And then the last point I want to make, which just sort of extends that question, is something I've been sort of thinking and writing about, which is, what does a client actually mean? Who is the client? What is the client? And actually the client, if in a single family house, the client collapses into one entity. But in most other projects we deal with, whether it's a university campus or it's the project you just showed us, the client gets differentiated into what I would call a patron client. So that's the president of the IDB in your case. And then you have an operational client, which are all the architects, engineers who are part of IDB who are making your project operational. And then you have the user client, which are the people who you are representing implicitly. Most often we pander in a way to the operational client, right? Because that's where the most pragmatism lies, the costs, the possibilities, etc. But actually part of the activism that I'm describing is the architect's responsibility to bridge through feedback loops all those three components of the clients. And that's when you kind of get the synthesis and you get the solution which represents all their aspirations in some ways. And which is what I think for me, I just wanted to end by saying that this building, it represents that understanding of the complexity of what that category of the client means. And then the role of the architect as activists, not jumping around making noise, but actually trying to create a synthesis between those aspirations and manifesting that spatially in wonderful ways. So with that, I mean, those were really observations and comments, but I thought one point of entry to the discussion might be, what was your experience in that negotiation between the clients? Because, you know, you said, I mean, this also required a patron client who could take the risk of moving ahead with something like this.
Well, I think this is fascinating, all what you've been talking about, and this is exactly the challenges for which at least I received no training in the university, and this brings another big question of what should we be learning in universities? How should we be trained as architects? The activism part, for some reason, it kind of represents somebody that from outside puts pressure in somebody. So you're threatening somebody, then that's why I don't like that. I would prefer to call the first two L's, listen and learn, that if you work from within, the first thing is that you have to swallow and learn the language of those you're talking to. And once you've shut up and just swallow information. What are the words that in a bank are used? In a board, in between the president and the operational, there's the board. And that's a worldwide thing from Japan putting money in the IDB to Europe. So it's not even Latin American interest. It's money from all around the world that is, and that's a board in the end. And the intelligence of the president was that of saying, well, if we ask other people to submit projects and then we study or the value they're able to produce, shouldn't we be doing the same for us? So it has a very objective way that from within, once you prove that, then you can't say no. So it's not a threat. It's all of a sudden, it's yourself being forced to be consequent with what you've done, and in order to find those gaps of integrity, let's say, then there's no excuse for the state, for a private company, or even for civil society not to move ahead. And for that, we need to learn that language. And that, in a way, is not necessarily, not always, the case of an activist. That it sometimes is more of a tantrum, you know. I want this, so I cry, I shout. And I guess it's more efficient to use the energy once you have identified a common good as your goal. Then the forces at play had to be reoriented and rechanneled more than resisted or fought. Well, sometimes you have to. I mean, there are moments where you have to be prepared either to lose your job, and that's very true as well. Or to be able to use people's threatening capacity to achieve a much bigger goal. But I prefer to be nerd and study and swallow the languages of these other institutions. How does a state operate? How does a company operate? And from within be able to find those voids. The same way lawyers, I guess, study legal voids, you study design voids. Here's an opportunity, let's say, there's to do that. I would also like to connect what you mentioned, the role of the state and privates and civil society, these three forces. And I think that's very important. States, and we have learned this lately during the pandemic, trying to move fast with projects that can correct some things that were pending in our cities that have shown very brutally the inequalities. I mean, the most are suffering the most are those that were suffering from economic inequalities. Now it's sanitary inequalities, and now it's becoming even more pressing. So state normally operates and does only what the law says. So the law operates for states, and if it's written, then I do it. If it's not written, I don't do it. Private sector operates different. If it's not forbidden, then I can do that. And of course, this can lead to abuse and corruption, but it has the potential for innovation. There's, in any case, these public partnerships, the 3 Ps, in which the state, that is a guarantee, let's say, at least theoretically, for common good, is there so that if there's any shadow of doubt, well, we have invented states to guarantee common good. But then we use the speed and agility of the private sector to do what is not, everything that is not forbidden. Otherwise, you never move ahead. States move very slowly and will only react to problems, never to proactively go before a problem. That's why in the best cases, we stay even, but even is not enough for the type of solutions that we're looking for. That's why adding a 4P, the private, public, people's partnership, it's important. And once you've framed the third force and invited the fourth force, people, civil society, into the equation, I guess the role of the state is that a public policy does everything that civil society cannot do individually on their own. And there, the scarcest resource is not money, but coordination. The moment you create the frame, and design and form has a big role in that, then you're not looking at architecture as a product, but as a process. You're just starting something that then, is completed over time. And cities are very much like that. You just have to do with public funding and with professional capacity what individual actions cannot guarantee, which is the coordination of the common good. So in that sense, open systems, porous urbanism, incrementality, and this is a word I would like to focus. Normally we do the question of the big majority that you were referring to. For the big majority, scarcity is the rule. Not enough money, not enough time. And a way, not the only one, but one way to deal with scarcity is incrementality. If you don't have the time nor the money to do everything at the beginning, we'll focus on what's more difficult and allow an open system to complete itself over time. And their coordination, it's crucial. Participation, in that sense, is the most important thing, so that we sit on the table on day one with the public, the private sector, and the people, so that we split tasks. And the moment you're creating a more participatory environment, I guess that the social forces, that is not just money or economic income, or, I am part of this society. Do I belong to this society as a valid citizen? Is the type of things that I guess are the forces that I'm more interested and at the same time worried about lately. In Chile, we had this explosion of the social ticking time bomb in October last year. So a country that was relatively doing well in economic terms, but for some, not for the majority, and that was somehow invisible, yet in the city was quite obvious. On paper, this should be a kind of successful country, yet the anger, the resentment that accumulates and then explodes with violence is one of the forces that I guess that we will have to begin to deal with more and more often.
Thank you, Alejandro. No, thank you for this kind of very overarching set of things you've touched upon, which answer, I think, also many questions that I had. So I'm just going to kind of pick one or two questions from the audience, and one sort of that picks up on your adding the additional P. It's from Pulak, who says, what has been the reaction of the community to such a radical intervention which connected two contrasting sides? Do you have any feedback? Did you present to them? and what might be learnings?
Yes, and this has happened whenever we do social housing as well. The better off, the wealthy, of course, see the poor as a threat, yet all the workforce of that former city comes from that slum. So even the security guards, the cleaning, the cooking, they all live in the slum. But when they're perceived, now we're going to connect, now that's a threat. But you had those people working in your everyday life in any case, actually, and they were spending valuable time of their lives just walking to arrive to work in your house. Imagine the change in the mood of people if you make their journey on a daily basis easier, if you walk in a safer, cleaner, healthier environment, and just make your arrival to work a more pleasant experience. But if, of course, it was perceived as a threat for the people in the informal settlement. It's self-explanatory. I mean, the meetings took a couple of seconds and then everybody understands the game. The advantage of working in Argentina and coming from Chile is that we were able to communicate, and this is mainly public opinion, in forums with the other side, with the wealthier part. Well, we made those mistakes in Chile already. So don't make them again. In Chile, well, there are three, and we were talking about three alternatives here. What do? Nothing. If we do nothing, then we have October last year in Chile. This will explode in an uncontrolled way. So what you're going to get is much worse than what you think is a threat when you try to improve right now living conditions. Alternative two, and this was very openly discussed in media and in local forums. I mean, by why making them stay there? Why don't you relocate them somewhere else? Well, the peripheries in Latin America are that. And we already did with the slums that of relocating them in the outskirts. So the ticking time bomb took slightly longer, but it is even harder to dismantle. This is the case in Chile, where the ticking time bomb now is in thousands of hectares of poor people that now see the wealthy as the reason for their bad living conditions. For their abuse, they just took care of themselves and not from us. So this is just about postponing the problem, not dealing with it. There was a third thing being discussed, which is, well, the moment we invest money in here, gentrification. So all the money is going to end up in the pockets of the even wealthier. So for the left, let's say, it was a perpetuation of the system, and that's why the project of the World Bank and the IDB in bringing the rule of law into an informal settlement, giving rights of property in addition to sanitation. If gentrification happens, then it's going to be good news, because that money is going to go into the pockets of the people that need more the money, and not just in the case of a few landlords. Evidence shows, though, that the moment you can offer location for the people that need it the most, closeness to opportunities, then nobody sells the land. I mean, they can inherit. If you have the property rights and you can inherit your household to your children, then you're taking advantage of maybe the most valuable of all things, that is to be part of a society and not just segregated somewhere in the periphery. And as soon as you do that, a new pact, a new deal eventually may be created in a society. And unfortunately for Chile, but luckily for the discussion in Argentina, we had evidence that you should anticipate what we didn't have evidence for from the 80s and the 90s, particularly the 80s in the dictatorship. What we did was what you're discussing now, and it proved to be very wrong 30 years later. And now we're in deep trouble. Now to try to dismantle the bomb, it's going to be really complicated.
Thank you, Alejandro. Again, you covered lots of sort of interesting issues there. And I'll kind of go to the last question, which you've you've partly answered, and so it could be short, or you might have other things to say, which is that this is from Parshav Seth, which is that this was particularly a bank project, but it's opened up new ways of approaching the problem. What is the potential you see outside support from, say, institutions like the bank? Could developers be co-opted into this kind of imagination? Because it's really, to use that horrible term, it's a win-win situation for everyone. And so what are your reflections on that for possibilities of patronage and facilitation in the future?
I think it's a very good question, and the first thing that comes to my mind is the war on the cliche. I guess that if you already think, well, the bank, no, these are the bad guys. I mean, that's missing a huge opportunity of if we put everybody in the same basket and don't make the intellectual exercise of understanding who is who, then we may miss the opportunities to change situations in a rather short period of time. Maybe not all the banks would have done that, but this particularly thought of themselves being a development bank. And in that sense, it's not our merit, it's their own merit. They already had the bold decision of saying, well, what if we put the bank in the slum? More than half of the work is done when you have an institution that is already being able to think that bold and against their own cliches. In the bank briefing, let's say, and that's why they said, okay, let's go for the voting in the Congress to open a possibility of the using of air rights. Because if we're able to pass this law, this is not going to benefit only us. It's going to benefit every single institution that would like to make it differently and provide a new ground that was not there before. And in that sense, I didn't show it here, but one of the pictures we showed to the board in Washington was an aerial photograph of cities that had rivers. How often do they have bridges? And in this case, one bridge would have not made the job. Whenever you want to create a kind of level development on one side of a river and then the other side, well, the frequency of bridges and infrastructure is not every single street in the grid, but every 2 or 3 blocks, you may need a bridge. So the IDB may be doing one of those bridges across the river of trains, but we will need 10 more to integrate the neighborhood. So if we pass this law, then we will be creating a more fairer ground for others to come. And this, I guess, that the moment, when you're operating and doing a project, and Shankar was thinking of that, well, not only my project, what if we can think of, for every single courtyard, not even ourselves, to be able to have a new core of sanitation and kitchen and everything. Well, I guess that the moment you're looking at your own project, not as unique, but as something that can be replicated. And this, I guess, goes against what we have been trained for. The value in art is associated with the notion of uniqueness. I mean, if something is unique and doesn't have a second, not even a copy, then the higher the value. But I guess for some projects like this one, if you do something that happened only once, then your value is close to 0. So this requires for us to change our notion of value from uniqueness, that might be the case in some situations, but not always, to in-housing. Whenever we're thinking of processes, well, there may be that possibility of working for others contained, since you're going to invest a lot of time and energy anyhow. So try to be efficient with your heartbeats somehow.
Thank you. Lovely note literally lovely note to end on. But, I just sort of in closing want to make some connections and just picking up what you've said. And, I think it is part of the problem is the categories we trap ourselves in, right? And part of that is to do with the obsessive autonomy of architecture. And it's, as you had sort of just described in your closing notes. And I think we have to look at that differently typologically, because in some types, actually, life corroding architecture is more important than the autonomy of the architecture, because then it creates the integration in society. And therefore, even the categories by which we organize the world, whether it's the simplistic binaries, but even when we talk about conservation, I mean, Zhang's projects are about conservation, but transitioning into a future and showing new possibilities. So it is completely demolishing the usual category of what a conservation architect should be doing, which is just opposing change, and therefore then the confrontation. And that's why I think you picked up on what we were discussing of the activist, because the activist is seen as someone confronting and then seen as a dangerous situation. And therefore, what happens is really, and that's why I think civil society as a category for us to imagine our forms of patronage is important, because otherwise we tend as architects to live in one of the binaries, right? We either align with the patron client or we align with the user client, and then we become activists trying to only represent the user client but not create the synthesis. And a better metaphor, perhaps, and literally alluding to your projects, almost literally, maybe we should see ourselves as bridge practices, as disciplines and practitioners who are always bridging in the way you showed us you were doing in the city. So it's metaphorically, but also I think literally a good way to describe our new emerging forms of practice in society. And I think just in closing, I think this session and the keynote were fabulous tributes to Charles Correa. I think one of the things that I would like to say in paying this tribute is, I think all of you showed, and I think through the conference, what has been reinforced is the importance, the criticality of us imagining nestled scales. And it's not only imagining scales as architects from the doorknob to the city, but it's also imagining scales in terms of our constituencies that we engage with in iterative processes that create substantial feedback loops that make us these bridge practitioners for society. And I think in his own practice, he demonstrated it wonderfully, all the way from what Zhang and Ranjit Hoskote and others talked about, the hawkers and accommodating hawkers in an arcade on a temporal scale, day and night, by actually designing just a small platform, all the way to doing housing projects where these ideas aggregate, to designing a new city in New Bombay, but then also heading a national commission on urbanization for the country. And so what a fantastic symbol of nestled scales. And so I think this conference has been a great tribute to not only his work, but it also shows us, with all of us feel optimistic that there's so many people doing very good work. And I think we'll transform society in positive ways as architects, and our agency as architects, I hope we will develop and build on. And so with that, I want to thank everyone in today's session, Tom, Zhang, and Alejandro. And I'm going to hand it over to Nandita to close this conference. So thank you very much.
Hi, and thank you all of you. Thanks Tom and Zhang and Alejandro for really good, amazing presentations. I think Tom and Zhang the fine grainness of looking at what could be and what is possible at that scale. With between the dwelling and to really to put people, make it people-centric, which is what at all levels, I think that's what we as architects do, is be able to bring people to at the heart of it, and that it's not form and it's not all the other things that we also need to discuss and look at, but really being people-centric. And I think I think also Alejandro's presentation, I think, is wonderful thing of looking at what is possible then to do, and to, I think, looking at what you would describe of incrementality, of participation is really quite, I mean, it's really, really important. And I think going back to really almost the first lecture, the memorial lecture, which where Mirai Chatterjee talks about the fissures in our societies and how they have really come to the front right now in this pandemic, and how everything has really changed in a way, because we've had to all the problems where we haven't dealt with housing, where we haven't dealt with healthcare, all that seems to have now come and really made us rethink of how we need to deal with these things. So I think in many ways, when we were sort of looking at what this conference should be about, we were looking at what, using the neighborhood as a kind of the base kind of entity. And I think in a way, everything has kind of fitted in really well in how we are looking at community. I mean, neighborhood is being another term for community and what is needed to really stitch everything together. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to everyone, to the audience who stayed with us over a month, in a way, to celebrate Charles's 90th birth anniversary, and it's been a wonderful, if not hectic, and at times very nerve-wracking month. But thank you everyone, and thank you to DNA, who've done amazing with our technical collaborators with this, who have really walked us through the whole thing, to the entire CCF team, and to also to people who have supported us, even financially, just to get this out. So, and don't forget, there's a competition that follows this, and the two competitions, the design competition, which I talked about earlier, and also don't forget the film competition, which is on housing, on it's not just affordable housing, but it's adequacy in housing, which is everything that we were just talking about with Alejandro, which is really bringing housing into sort of because it is a fundamental right, the right to shelter, but to get shelter in the right place, and make it's not just being affordable housing, it's everything else that it needs to be. So yes, thanks very much, and it's just a fantastic session to end with, and thank you, Rahul, too. Yes, thanks very much. Bye. Bye.